Welcome back to Running the Show. This is season 2 of the production. This year, we're focusing a little bit more narrow on a singular topic. We're going to explore through research, speculation, kind of like an op-ed style, and we will be bringing in some additional perspectives as well. So this particular chapter is going to be on the Netlfix documentary series that's going to be coming out in 2024, specifically on track and field. We heard this announcement in August of 2023. Netlfix announced it. There were some speculative articles, Runner's World, Cities Mag, Canadian Running Deadline, a lot of people entering the conversation to speculate about this, but we haven't really heard much since. There's not much to talk about because there hasn't been additional information, at least not from what I've found. And the goal of this discussion through multiple parts here is taking the research that we have, what is out there in the world, and doing a little bit of healthy exploration, I hope, in terms of, narrative arcs. What is a storyline potentially in this track and field version of the docuseries? What kind of things will this docuseries accomplish for track and field? What things will it probably not? What are the similarities and differences to the other sports that have been featured in this format? All I want to do here, just as a person, is to, I guess, encourage people to kind of deepen their appreciation and deepen their curiosity for what to expect. I know I'm looking forward to this docuseries and hope that is conveyed through this, but I just want to make sure that people are getting the curiosity element from this and are very excited potentially about what's to come. So let's get into our first part of this series about what we know and some speculation. I want to go over kind of the timeline of things so far. We'll do a little bit of healthy speculation thereafter. And I'll be checking some notes that I have here to make sure that what I have is up to date and kind of orient us within the conversation. So to start off, right, jumping right in, a statement released from Netlfix in August of 2023 confirmed the following, right? They confirmed that we have a debut in the summer of 2024. This is something that Cities Mag has also speculated would correlate with the 2024 Olympics. So similar to the F1 format of Drive to Survive, having a series come out right before competition starts. I know Cities Mag pointed that out, and I think it's an astute observation that we'll probably be seeing this closer to the Olympic timeline. And the notes that they provided as well from this press release is Netlfix is in production on a new sports documentary series tracking top sprinters from the countries including the United States, Jamaica, United Kingdom, Ivory Coast, Kenya, and Italy. So we have an idea of the players that they're going to be going over, right? This is a little bit like they're dangling the carrot in front of us. They're not confirming certain people or not at this point, but the synopsis they provide for us as well is they're following athletes from all over the world. And this series delves deep into the psyches of those elite competitors who train to be the fastest person on the planet. They take an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the high stakes, the mental toughness of those sprinters who devote their entire lives to crossing the finish line in record time, where their professional futures are decided in just fractions of a second. Pretty compelling statement. And it says that we're going to get 6 45-minute episodes. So things are kind of looking good, right? We're not getting a flash in the pan. We are getting several episodes that are going to explore this. Now, they do quote Seb Coe, World Athletics president here, and the quote that I want to share with everybody from him in that press release is, "We're delighted that Netlfix has chosen to turn a spotlight onto the lives of the fastest people on Earth. It takes a special talent, both physically and mentally, to succeed in a world where your fate is decided in just 10 seconds. As Muhammad Ali said, the fight is won or lost far away from the witnesses, behind the lines, in the gym, and out there on the road, long before I dance under those lights. The same applies to our athletes, that we can think no better than Netlfix to give our fans new insight into the fascinating, high-intensity world of sprinters as they prepare to take their shot at glory at the World Championships. So that is a little bit more information for us to work off of, right? Seb talks about World Championships. Seb talks about 10 seconds. So that leans towards hundreds. We don't really have much to go off of there, but compelling statement. Let's keep going through the facts, right? Let's keep pushing through. And we were lucky to see a Deadline article that covered this as well. They searched for a bit more information, compiled things. So Deadline stated that this series will focus on both 100 and 200 meter sprinters. They mentioned the same countries that they mentioned in the athletics release from Netlfix. But more recently, Canadian Running Magazine reported that it'll follow athletes such as Noah Lyles, Fred Curley, Dina Asher-Smith, potentially also Christian Coleman, and Marie-Josée Tallou, right? So we're getting a clearer picture on who's going to be there and kind of the timeline for this, just based off of these sources that have stated this so far. According to that same running magazine, Canadian Running Magazine article, it'll cover the Diamond League Continental Tour, and camera crews were also reported at US Champs, London Diamond League, and the World Champs. So a lot of hearsay going on, a lot of speculation going on within like the traditional media sense as well. But let's get into some things that we know a little bit more, right? We can be a little bit more confident in the outlook of this. We know that this series will be produced by Box to Box Films. They produce Drive to Survive, Full Swing, Breakpoint, and Tour de France Unchained. So we know the quality and the style of production to expect there. So if anyone has seen those other productions, famed series that have been renewed for several seasons, has been part of this bigger push that we've seen on Netlfix in recent history to kind of deepen this understanding and love and admiration for sports and the storylines kind of embedded in them. Apparently, they're also producing series on the World Cup, Six Nations Rugby Championship, and the U.S. Women's National Team going for the World Cup as well. So this production company, Box to Box, has a pretty deep, I don't know, they just have a lot of momentum in the sports storytelling space. They've also done some one-off documentaries that we've seen as well, or that at least we can recognize on specific athletes as well. So not only have they focused on leagues or these organizations, but they know how to focus on the individual storylines. So it seems like this is a great, production company to trust when it comes to sports, capital S. Have we seen things that they've done in track and fields? No. But there aren't too many players in the space, right? Like we've seen some documentaries on Peacock about Noah Lyles, Dina Asher-Smith that focus on more so the athlete as they, pursue this kind of world best or road to the Olympics side of things. But Box to Box, I think there's a lot of positive energy focusing on kind of the repertoire of that production agency. And a quote from Kyle Merber at the Lab Count is, "This is our drive to survive moment, or so we hope," right? So I figured now could be a good time, right? Knowing that Box to Box is leading this charge, right? They're leading this narrative entity. Let's compare, if possible, the similarities and differences that these other series may have to track and field, right? This could be good for us to recognize maybe the kind of structure that'll take place by speculating, okay, these elements do match really well, or these elements don't. And we can get a clearer picture for how this story might be told. So starting with Drive to Survive, this is a series that's been renewed for several seasons over the course of several years. and it's been largely successful. It's been very, people love it, right? It was a point of entry for many folks, and it's still popular. It's a great benchmark or litmus test here. So the similarities that I think we can look at between F1, this Drive to Survive, or the F1 model to track and field, is the focus on the competition and character development. A lot of these series are going to hinge on, right, there's the competition element with all of them, whether it's the, Constructors' Cup that we're going after, the Builders' Cup, or even the specific single entities of, racing Abu Dhabi and who's going to win it. And there's the global competition aspect, right? Not only do you have the competing on the world scale, whether it's Diamond League, World Championships, and the Olympics, another example here for track and field, right? Those competitions themselves are taking place globally, but you also have the global competition aspect of athletes from around the world as well, right? We've confirmed through these articles that there will be certain countries represented, which will be interesting to see, right? Same thing applies with the F1 side of things, right? There's competition that they pursue on multiple continents, multiple countries, and then also the additional element of where these drivers are from and who they represent, and taking that angle. Now, the differences between track and field and F1, I'll focus mainly on the F1 side of things. Just some things I'm speculating about is the limited variables of F1 are definitely something to be noted, right? The 2024 season for F1 has 24 races, period. It's 10 teams, period. 20 active drivers, period. And the summation of the season is based on these points that are earned in those 24 races. So this is all to kind of put the spotlight on the organizational structural difference. F1 is a insulated governing body that controls every aspect of competition. With track and field, but not even talking about road racing or any other kind of discipline. With track and field, right, you have individual athletics organizations. You have USATF, for example, but then you also have World Athletics that they work together, but it's not a singular body deciding everything, right? So it is a little bit trickier from a variables perspective for track and field to kind of fit within or color between the lines in a way that, from a storytelling aspect, it's a lot clearer in the F1 model that it just makes sense. 24 races, 10 teams, 20 active drivers, one winner, right? It's kind of is just cut and dry. Now, the other things to note here is length of play. The length of play for F1 is long, right? It's 57 laps or 50 to 70 laps itself in the race in Abu Dhabi or at Silverton, right? All of these particular race days are long hours. People are tuning in for a long period of time, but you also have the pomp and circumstance of practice rounds, which are televised, qualification, which is televised, and race day, which is that 50 to 70 laps. So that's a lot of content that you can use in any way, shape, or form. Not only from a viewing aspect, but from the idea of building a narrative arc. You could have a storyline recently in practice at the inaugural Las Vegas Grand Prix. In practice, one of the drivers hit a pothole, a manhole that was not sealed shut, and it shut down practice. Everyone had to stop. The fans had to be evacuated because it was too late. Right? All of this drama comes out of practice, not even the competition itself, which is going to be, in most cases, the highest or the height of the discussion. When it comes to the sprinters aspect, if we're looking at 100 and 200 folks, right, we're talking about between like 9 seconds and like 25 seconds of actual competition. I know they said they're going to focus on the psyche, the training, what goes on, not necessarily the tip of the iceberg aspect of competing, but that is a fundamental difference, is that length of play in the F1 model versus track and field. Now, another thing to note, just while we're on like the concept of the competition aspect, I think it's an interesting element that F1 has, the track and field doesn't, where track and field in the 100 and the 200 and all these other events, the variables are on the day of race day are pretty limited, right? Weather is going to be the main thing that'll dictate, maybe altitude in some cases. But 100 meters is 100 meters is 100 meters. 200 meters is the same. In the competition for F1, for example, the track itself, Abu Dhabi drives differently than Monaco, right? There's different skills that appeal to the driving sentiments of certain drivers. So it kind of changes the narrative to, who is more skilled potentially or just lucky on a day-to-day in F1 competition. In track and field, it is a little bit more cut and dry in terms of the track is going to run similarly for all. So the main variables are going to be, I wouldn't say luck, but it's going to be more so like raw performance on the day, right? The body as an instrument kind of thing. And that's just something that I expect to be a different thing as well. Now, also discuss the storyline aspect. A difference that I see here from F1 to track and field is also like the storylines in F1 are relatively broad because there's a team aspect, right? There's not only Lando Norris, but there's the McLaren team aspect of storytelling, right? You can talk about the individuals associated. You could talk about even the equipment itself as it relates to this. You could also, Carlos Sainz and Ferrari, right? Like there's additional people within the scope of competition who provide some kind of mirror for narrative. In track and field, I guess you could look into training groups. You could look into coaches and those kind of relationships, agents, maybe training partners, but it's not necessarily as baked in as it is for the F1 model, which I think is definitely worth noting, right? The people from the F1 series had strong opinions about like the team principles. For example, like Gunther from Haas was beloved, whereas Christian Horner was like painted as the from Red Bull was painted as like the villain, right? And I don't necessarily see the opportunity for someone, let's say track and field, for like the coach like Bobby Kersey to be painted as like an angelic figure versus like another coach who's going to be like the antithesis of that, who's going to be like, the villain of the discussion. So that'll just be an interesting thing. But a glaringly obvious difference as well is also funding, right? In track and field, if we're focusing on the athletes here, there will be some sponsored athletes in the mix. I would assume that most of them are. The brands will kind of probably play an aspect in the storytelling in track and field. But with F1, yes, there are principal sponsors. It's why we know that, there's a team Ferrari, a team Aston Martin, and a team Alpine. But there are so many sponsors and so much funding within the space. Like even the investors were getting like some play in the F1 narrative, which I don't think will play the same in track and field. So just some fundamental differences. So with the differences being like the organizational structure, the potential storylines, the variables that are limited, the length of play, the course playing an element in narrative, and the funding as well. Like I don't think that the track and field series will map perfectly onto F1, and it'll probably map a little bit closer onto the other series potentially that Box to Box has done before. So another one that I think will be a little bit tough for the mapping onto, and probably will not provide, let's say, a good prescriptive model for Box to Box to produce here, is the Tour de France Unchained documentary. So the similarities here, right? It's an endurance-based sport. It's less emphasis on, let's say, skill or like money in a sense, and at least within the people who are competing. And it's more a focus on like, it's more of a focus on like just the raw power and performance of a body as an instrument, right? Like I'm not thinking that this bike is infinitely more, I don't know, like better equipped than another bike that somebody's on, and that's going to dictate the race in a way that like F1 would have been. So that is a similarity, right? It's more about the athlete itself. It's about the endurance more so than like the skill or the equipment that they're on, to some extent. At least that's a speculation I think we could look into. The differences here, right, to lay these out would be the single tournament style focus, that length of play, again, that kind of similar thing to F1 with the course providing a narrative element itself, and the additional like team and team principle storylines, right? So to get through this a little bit quicker, right, the single tournament style, right, the Tour de France has several stages in the scope of one competition. There are multiple different aspects of how people can, get points, and who is wearing a white jersey versus a red jersey versus a green jersey versus a polka dot jersey, right? These are all, storylines that exist, but all of those things are predicated on this single umbrella competition that's going on. And track and field doesn't have that, right? We're not saying that the person who wins 2024 is like getting points across like a set number of competition points through the year. They're just not. So that's a big difference to bring in there. Length of play, right? Similar to F1, I think a big difference here is there's 21 stages of the Tour de France. Each one of those are like 3.5 hours long. They might not all be on the saddle for 3.5 hours, right? When they do time trials, it's quicker, but the coverage that's produced here is hours. So they have the ability to craft quite a narrative that's all kind of compounding day over day and crescendoing towards that final day, right? Oftentimes, like somebody like Pogacar might clinch the jersey, like he might clinch the victory before the end of those stages, but it's still a crescendo towards the end, and it's still celebrated as such, which is different than I think the way track and field could be looked at here. Now, similar to the course conversation we were having with F1, right? Each stage of the Tour de France, they do change the Tour de France course year over year, oftentimes to introduce variables and to make, a certain climbing stage harder, or to make a time trial stage difficult. And even like the day of each one of these stages is important, right? If a time trial is on day 1, it's going to be different than if a time trial is on day 16. And that is all up to the organizers to dictate, right, what the athletes do, and the skill set of certain athletes will shine on different days. So you're getting potentially different like stars and star power every day of competition, as opposed to, what could be the gun goes off under 10 seconds of competition. So, and then another one as well is that team and team principles narrative structure, right? You have, Jumbo Visma, you have Ineos, you have, like Alpecin, right? Like all of these teams in themselves have their own kind of narrative element to them, why people like them, why people don't like certain teams. And same thing with the principles, like the people who are in charge of coaching these teams and getting the best out of these players, the best out of these cyclists, is very different, right? There's some people who take the softer approach, the trust approach, and then there's some folks who are really hard-nosed and really, I don't know, you seem like they're really hard to work with. And you as a viewer you just create an emotional attachment to those individuals who aren't even on a bike. So that's just something I think could be different as well. So for those reasons, I don't think that Tour de France Unchained model will map perfectly onto track and field. What is likely, in my speculation, the model of storytelling that could land the best for track and field is Full Swing, which is the golf model, and Breakpoint, which is the tennis model that Box to Box produced. So getting into Full Swing, similarities here to me on the golf side is they're kind of charged to choose individual athlete stories. There's too many players in the space in the way that people can enter and get their pro card. So it's on the production team to kind of choose the people they're going to look after. There could always be an out of left field performance that they don't catch, and that's just a risk they run because they're betting on certain people. So that's something that could be similar to the track and field side of things, like even focusing, somebody's in a room writing that script or putting the proposal together to decide that they want to, follow Rory McIlroy or like Joel Damon, right? Those are compelling individuals. They don't have to be top performers. They could just be compelling, right? Joel Damon is somebody that people fell in love with because of the way that he approaches the sport, not necessarily because he's winning. He definitely has the ability to, but Rory or like somebody in that nature, that's going to be the top performer narrative as opposed to the Joel, who's going to be like the heartstrings guy. And the other thing that could be a similarity here is the multiple tournament structure. You have the US Open, the PGA Championship, you have Augusta, right? There's multiple tournaments that they're not related to each other in a sense, right? Like you don't need to know who won the US Open to know anything that's going to happen in the PGA Championship. It could indicate it, right? In the same way in track and field, where like you could see somebody on a tear and they crushed London Diamond League going into like a huge race that's coming up into, world championships. That's good. That might indicate that they could be a great performer, but it doesn't secure it. And it doesn't prevent that person or somebody who didn't perform well in, a previous thing to have the opportunity to get into it. So that's something that feels like a similar, a hurdle potentially that they'll have to work through narratively, but something that could be, they've done it before in a sense, right? Through Full Swing. Now the difference here, you're going to hear, like I'm a broken record in this regard. Differences for me are the length of play, the course as well, and then the funding. But there's an additional conflict that was very specific, kind of built into the Full Swing that we'll touch on as well. So, right, the length of play is long. A full weekend is just content that they have to work with. Even the drama of making the cut, right? I didn't know that was a thing prior, where you have to perform in a certain way to be in the top half of performance or up over a certain barrier to have the ability to compete the next day. It's kind of similar to qualifying in that regard, in track and field, but the length of play is long. You're playing a full 18 plus to make the cut. And then it's like the day where everyone focuses on, right? Like it's that final round that people are looking at on the final day. So that length of play is going to allow for multiple storylines to kind of come up time over time. The course as well, right? Like the altitude, the layout, everything about a golf course can change, right? To play to the strengths of a certain athlete. You could argue that on the track and field side, that just doesn't exist potentially, right? So it's not like you have to worry about like a hilly 5K on the road or like a mountain race or something like that, where the terrain can dictate potentially who's going to come out on the other side of it. So I would say, like, although the variables of a golf course are pretty limited, there's water, there's sand, and there's rough, but it's still something that could play to the strength of some more than others. Even like how fast the greens are running could be something that dictates like the storyline in that regard. The funding is something we touched on in like F1, for example. Multiple sponsors for tournaments and multiple sponsors for athletes kind of lead to some storylines about, how people are navigating things. And that's not necessarily the case in track and field. It just hasn't been built into the structure that a lot of athletes have access to. But another big difference, this is something that's kind of a moot point because it is so specific to the Full Swing, at least at the time in that first season, was the LIV league versus PGA, right? There was a private entity that popped up and they were kind of stealing players from the PGA and offering them a ton of money to go and bring them over. And there was this whole thing where if you went over, the PGA would excommunicate you and you weren't allowed to play in PGA events anymore, but people are getting paid so much they didn't care. And then there was like the whole greenwashing or sport washing element of like who was funding the operation. And that was a whole element of like, exploration, which that's not going to exist in this track and field thing unless somebody comes around with a boatload of money and is offering some exclusive league for like the American Track League or something of that nature. Or Diamond League was like stealing athletes that can only perform on the Diamond League, whatever. That's not going to be an element that we'll see in track and field. So definitely some differences to be drawn there, but I do think those similarities of like the picking your winners and those individual athlete stories, and then also the multiple tournament structure is another thing to note as well. And those things also map, I think, pretty well from a similarities perspective to Breakpoint, which is the tennis side of things. The similarities there, right? You're picking your winners out of a huge roster. You're picking Iga Swiatek or, Isla. I'm going to completely ruin your last name. Tomljanovic, right? They had to pick those athletes to follow. There's a good chance that they might miss some, and they're following more so, right, the compelling individuals. It's the person who's going to provide a perspective during the scope of competition, not necessarily like that they're crushing victory. It is cool to have that person, but they're not choosing the top four in that regard. And that multiple tournament structure, right? US Open, Wimbledon, Australian Open. It goes through the year. It is kind of chronological in that regard, but it doesn't, I feel like the only person I saw going through all of those is like Iga Swiatek, right? I'm also probably ruining her name. Iga performed at every single one of these tournaments practically, or at least the ones that they chose to focus on. So you saw that person as like a through line in all of them, but you wouldn't necessarily see the same athlete doing every single competition. And I think track and field would be similar. I don't think you're going to, at least as I remember through the season, you're not seeing the same exact people on the line of the final of like London Diamond League and then World Championships. So it will be, I think, similar in terms of a hurdle for them to tell that story, but something that they've done before, and I think they'll do it well in that regard. Let's look at those differences again. Again, I'm a broken record. The differences here for me include length of play, again, and the course changes here. Now, the length of play is long. The games are over 2 hours. Tournaments are several weeks long. Not several weeks. They're, over the course of several days. Wimbledon's super long, so there's a lot of things that can play out in that regard. On the side of course changes, right? Some of these things that were highlighted were like playing clay courts versus grass courts, playing hard courts, and who is better, right? Who's the king of clay? Who's the queen of clay? And who is like, best on grass? So those are things that just are not going to be built into a track and field setting to kind of take you through there. So I know there was a lot of speculation bouncing around and points, similarities, differences as it kind of takes us through things. But again, to kind of sum things up, I think the two models of storytelling that Box to Box has done before, if we want to kind of go deeper and speculate and ask questions, I think it helps to have like a control in terms of this experiment. And the control for me is probably like Full Swing, which is their golf series, or tennis, the Breakpoint series, right? The similarities being picking your winners out of that huge roster and the multiple tournament structure. And I bring that up. There's probably some other things as well, right? It's not going to map perfectly. Nothing's going to map perfectly onto track and field because it is unique. It is different. There's so many elements that, could come up that'll provide a storyline in track and field that are way better than some of the things that they had to develop on these other sport docuseries. But I think it's interesting just to think about what those storylines could look like in track and field. And similar to those other series, could open up some criticism as people are watching it, right? Like if you were a huge tennis fan and they didn't follow, your favorite person, that is kind of challenging, right? It's kind of like you don't get what you want out of this series in that regard, and you hope that they're featured the following series, at least in the scope of like Full Swing and Breakpoint. I do think this is going to be a really positive thing for track and field. I do think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out and how they're going to get over the barriers or like solve for the challenges of some of these things, because I feel like there's a lot of people who are in the track and field, sphere of fandom. They could range from people who are familiar with the event and they're familiar that the 100 and the 200 are at the Olympics, or that there's multiple, then you have people who know that there's the Diamond League exists and that there's this, structure of how you perform within the Diamond League, and they have their own trophy and they have their own prize money and things of that nature. And then there's people who know like what Dean Asher-Smith ran season best and personal best times. Like they know where and who was second, So there's a lot that they have to solve for here. And it is a challenge, but I think to kind of like put a bow on things, at least for this first, chapter, this first episode of speculation, if you will, it does seem like the right people are potentially at the helm. We haven't seen other people kind of be funded well enough to do something on this scale and in this way. And it seems really encouraging, right? Being able to see somebody have the resources and the access to produce something meaningful. And all we can hope, back to Merber's point here, that this is the this is the Drive to Survive moment. Appreciate everybody joining me on this first episode. And just to look forward, our second episode is going to be more so focused on the goals of a docuseries. Like, what do they aim to do? What does Box to Box as a production agency do well? And will track and field be mapped well onto, the aim of these docuseries? Like kind of comparing the performance, if you will, of these docuseries boosting awareness of the sport. What does it mean? And then we're going to go to the extent of maybe speculating about what it'll do for track and field. So that's going to be episode 2 coming up soon. But thank you again, folks, and we'll talk to you soon.